Hello, friends. I hope you're out wandering through nature, exploring the natural world around you. Do you enjoy writing about your wanderings? Nature journaling is an awesome, fun way to remember all the adventures you have taken and how you felt during those journeys. If you're looking for some beautiful journals to keep track of all your wanderings, I have several available on Amazon, including some guided journals for children. Start your journey in journaling by clicking on the link in the show notes. Keep exploring the nature around you and keep journaling all your wanderings. Hello, friends. I'm Paul, and welcome to the podcast. Today, I am in the studio. It's a rainy, windy day outside. I knew the quality of the recording wouldn't be very good, and I wanted to talk about this subject for a while, so I decided instead of doing it outside like I wanted to, I'm going to do it in the studio. I'm here watching the birds outside my window. I'm watching them at my feeders. I got lots of feeders out of my yard, and the birds, even though it's raining, they're enjoying it. And every once in a while I see the chipmunk dart out of my garden, and he runs over under the bird feeders because he's gathering up all the seed that the birds drop. So it's quite a wildlife habitat out here that the wildlife, the birds, the mammals, they're all enjoying. I see deer tracks in my yard all the time. In my woods, I've seen fox scat. I've seen coyote scat. I've heard the coyotes in the evening. I've heard the fox calling. Just the other night, I heard them calling. So they are all over my yard. And I want you to experience the same thing. How do you do that? Well, basically, you are going to create a backyard habitat. What do I mean by a backyard habitat? Well, if you want to see wildlife, you need to create a habitat for them. And the only way to do that is to give them what they want. Create a habitat, create a place for them to come. If you have a lot of loud noise in your yard, if you have nothing that they want, maybe no food, no cover, they're not going to come. So I want to talk to you today about how to create a habitat, a backyard habitat. In my case, it's a front yard. But I'm going to talk about basically creating a habitat out of your yard to attract more wildlife. And you may be thinking, why on earth would I want to attract all the wild animals to my yard? Well, hopefully you're like me. You're an outdoors person. You love nature. You love seeing the wildlife. You love seeing the wild animals. That's why you do it. It's mostly for, your viewing pleasure, for your enjoyment. It's also for relaxation. I've talked about how being in nature helps to relax. It helps your health overall. So it's all about you, at least part of it. I shouldn't say all about you. It's also about the wildlife. It helps them. Now, they can find food out in the wild. They can find what they need out in the wild. But on tough times, maybe you're going through a drought. Maybe you're going through heavy winter. The birds need a little extra help. The animals need a little extra help. So it kind of helps the wildlife during tough times. It also helps to replace lost habitat. When you create habitat in your yard, it's replacing habitat that someone else took away. Maybe your farmer in your community cut down a forest so that they could have a field to raise crops. You never know. Maybe they ripped down an area of habitat in order to create a mall, to put a road through. We're destroying habitat at an astonishing rate. So let's start putting some of it back in our own yards. Another thing is that basically creates a scientific study area. And I'll talk a little bit later about citizen science, which I've done an entire episode on that. So go back and look for that one. But it creates a study area, scientific study area, where you become the citizen scientist. And it also means less yard grooming. It seems every year I'm cutting back on how much yard I mow. I've got 12 acres, and the less I mow, the better. I probably mow right now less than a quarter of that 12 acres. So I don't mow much. So less work for you, less yard grooming. And finally, creating a habitat. It's fun. Yeah, it's fun to do. It's fun to create this habitat and to watch the wildlife that enjoys it. And hopefully you enjoy it as well. So why are you creating this habitat? It's mostly for the enjoyment of us and for the wildlife. So how do you attract the wildlife to your backyard? Well, first of all, it's 3 main things that every habitat needs to attract wildlife. The first thing is food. And then you need water. And the final thing, shelter. Some sort of shelter. And I'm going to break down these 3 things one at a time and talk a little bit more in detail about each one. But first, before you even start thinking about creating this habitat, I really want you to do some research on it. What sort of animals are you trying to attract? Then you can start to plan out your habitat. Maybe draw out a diagram of your yard and draw out where you want to put things. And how do you know what you want in your yard? Well, first of all, you researched it. Okay, so you have all that research. You know what animals you want. You know what attracts those animals. And then you can plan it out. After you've planned it out, then comes the fun part, at least in my opinion. You create it. Yeah, you'd start planting the plants you need. You start hanging the feeders you need. And all of this is a lot of fun, creating the habitat. And of course, the final step to a successful habitat, enjoy it. So you have the research, the planning, creating, and then of course, enjoying all the work you put into it. Now, as promised, I said I would break down the 3 essentials, food, water, shelter, and we'll talk a little more in detail about each. So with food, first of all, provide a variety. Make sure there's lots of different types of food. The more types, the more animals you're going to attract. For instance, my bird feeders. I don't just put one type of food out. I've got a feeder hanging with peanuts in it. I've got another one with black oil sunflower. I've got some suet feeders out. I've got a thistle feeder. And I get so many different species of birds because I have a wide variety of food. If you're trying to attract mammals, you can put out different foods for the mammals, maybe some peanuts on the ground, maybe a deer lick. Different foods will attract different wildlife. So do your research, figure out what they like, and provide a variety. Also try to find out if there's any species that you really want that are very specific in need. For instance, I was talking about the birds and how I have different feeders up. Well, there's hummingbirds who aren't going to go to any of my feeders except probably a hummingbird feeder. And then for the Orioles that I hear in my yard, I put out oranges and I put out an orange suet for them as well. And this is where I'm often asked, natural plantings or feeders? Well, that mostly depends on you. I like to put out a little bit of each. Okay, I do have feeders in my yard, like I just mentioned, but I also plant different plants that provide food. So maybe a berry bush. I have grapevines growing. I have butterfly bushes. I have a lot of different plants that provide natural foods for the birds. Also, these plantings are not just providing food, they're also providing shelter. That's why I like the plantings as well as the feeders. But maybe you don't have the room for the plantings. Then just go with feeders. Now, plantings also provide beauty. They often flower, so you get both food, both shelter, and beauty for yourself. Plantings are also less maintenance. You plant them once and you leave them. They do fine. Maybe you have to water them if you're having a dry spell, but for the most part, you do nothing with them once they're planted. Whereas with feeders, there's more maintenance. But on the other hand, feeders can be moved easily when needed. Maybe you have a feeder that's causing problems, it's too close to the house, the birds are running into your window. You can take that feeder and move it. If you have a bush there, you have to dig it up, dig another hole, plant it in the new hole, fill in the old hole. Yeah, you're moving an entire plant. Not easy. Feeders, they're much easier to move. And with the feed in the feeders, you can change it. You can provide more variety. That bush is going to provide one type of food. That's it. You want to provide a variety, you need to plant a lot of different types of bushes. But with feeders, you can always change the feeder and still have just one feeder. So a lot of it also depends on how much room you have. If you're in an apartment and you don't have much else than a porch, maybe a balcony, you're going to go with feeders. Maybe one little potted plant, but that's about it. You don't have the room for a lot of variety with plants, so you're going to be doing more feeders. So it all depends on what you want to do and what you have the time for. And like I said, feeders, they are extra care. You should always clean your feeders at least once a month. Make sure you empty them out of the food, wash them out, rinse them thoroughly, then refill them. You don't want them going bad. You don't want the food getting rotten in there, and it makes the bird sick. So always clean them. And you have to go out and fill them. So it could be the middle of winter and they're empty. You have to go out there and fill them. So a lot more care if you have feeders. And there's also added cost with feeders. You plant a bush, it's a one-time cost. You buy that bush, plant it, you paid for it once. You're done. With feeders, you have to keep buying food for the feeders. So it is an extra cost. So you weigh those two things out. I'm not going to tell you which is best for you. That's your decision. It also depends on your space, your finances. So there's a lot of factors, but there's your options. Now with water, the next critical part of creating a habitat. Water provides bathing and drinking for the wildlife. I find when I'm going on a hike somewhere, I see the most wildlife if I'm hiking along a creek, a stream, or around a pond or a lake. It's always around water is where you're going to see the most wildlife because they need to drink. They need to wash, bathe. So consider the species when you're choosing the size and location for providing water. Also consider how much room you have to provide that water. So maybe you have room for a large pond. I have a half-acre pond on my property. I get deer, I get fox coming down to the pond. I've had coyotes. I haven't seen them, but I've heard them, and I've seen their tracks around the pond. I get ducks, I get geese. But maybe you don't have room for that big of a pond. Maybe you don't want those big mammals around your property. Then you want to go smaller. Maybe you live in the middle of a city with just a balcony. Get a bird bath. It's much smaller. You're not going to get large mammals in the city. So what you're going to do with a bird bath is you're going to get the birds. And That's your wildlife. So consider the species when choosing the size and location, and consider how much room you have. Once again, big areas, you're going to get larger species. And the final part is providing shelter. Make sure you provide a place for the animals to hide, to get away from predators, to get away from danger. Now, these can be natural places or they can be man-made places. You also want to provide a place to raise young. Or maybe you don't want the babies on your property. But remember, we're not just doing this for us, we're doing it for the wildlife. So I prefer providing places for the animals to raise their young. And even if you don't want the young there, I will guarantee you have a tree or a bush, those birds are going to find a place to build a nest. So you will have young on the property. So you want a place for them to hide, and you want to provide a place for them to raise their young. How do you do that? Well, like I said, you can do it either naturally or man-made. And what do I mean by that? Well, with a natural shelter, you're talking planting trees or bushes. So maybe a nice pine tree. Oh, pine trees, great security, great shelter, great place to hide for a lot of different animals, not just birds, but also the mammals. Man-made? Now you're talking birdhouses. Yeah, if you build birdhouses, you're providing a place for the animals to get away from predators, but also a place for them to raise their young. Now, when you're building birdhouses, or if you're buying a birdhouse, make sure it fits for the species of birds you're trying to attract. The hole size and the size of the box are very critical, very important. I have 26, I believe. I should remember by now, but I never do. 26 boxes that I built and put up on my property. They're designed for bluebirds, but I get bluebirds, I get tree swallows. This year I've gotten chickadees. I've also gotten a nuthatch nesting in one of my boxes. So I get a lot of different birds nesting in these boxes, but they're small enough where I don't get robins or grackles or red-winged blackbirds. But the red-winged blackbirds actually chose the cattails. That's where they like to nest. They're in the cattails around my pond. The robins, well, they're up in the rafters of my shed. They're building on the ladder rungs hanging behind my shed. Yeah, there's robin nests in man-made areas, and I also have some in the bushes around my property. So I have both. Also, if you want, you can do what I call man-made natural. And you're probably wondering, what on earth is that? Man-made natural? Well, the next time you're cleaning up the brush around your property, maybe you had a windstorm come through and it knocked a bunch of branches down. Don't take those branches and just break them or put them out to the road for the garbage men to pick them up. Instead, build a brush pile somewhere on your property. That brush pile provides shelter for the birds and smaller mammals. Chipmunks, squirrels, they love those brush piles. Snakes, don't panic. Snakes are good for the environment too, and they usually leave you alone anyhow. But rabbits like these brush piles as well. So brush piles are an awesome way to combine both natural and man-made. Now, if you use plantings in your habitat, please use native species when creating your backyard habitat. If you're not sure what native plants are in your area, contact your local conservation organization, maybe a garden center, although be careful with garden centers. They're trying to sell you products, and a lot of them are not native. But tell them that you want just native species, and they usually can help you out very well. Or you can do research online. Do the research for your area, and please use native species when creating your habitat. The animals appreciate it, but also nature in general does. Research which plants are native to your area. Now you can also provide specialty gardens like butterfly gardens. Butterfly gardens, you'll have a lot of different native flowers. I'm stressing that native thing again. But plant native flowers that will attract butterflies, and usually you get bees too. You can put up butterfly houses. They work as well. Rotting logs they like as well. Put some sort of water feature in the garden. And this will attract certain species. And it's not just butterflies. There's other type of specialty gardens that you can create as well. Now, if you don't have a lot of room, that's okay. You can still create a habitat. Even a back deck can be turned into a wildlife habitat. They make these little buckets that you can put water in. And they have a pump on them so that you don't have the stagnant water. You don't want standing water because then you're creating mosquito habitat. And unless you have a lot of birds, those mosquitoes are going to start eating you alive. It's going to be a real pain real quick. So get something with some running water. And they make these little buckets that have the running water in them. So it keeps the water circulating and it keeps the mosquitoes from nesting in there. And you can also do plantings in these buckets. That way you have the water and you have the plants and you have the shelter. So now you've gotten all these animals. You've created your habitat. These animals are starting to come and you're enjoying them. How do you keep them there? Well, first of all, keep your habitat maintained. Once again, I talked about cleaning feeders, making sure the wildlife is kept healthy. And a really big one with me, don't use pesticides. Don't use any type of chemicals in your yard. I've had people call me and say, hey, I've lost all the birds. They stopped coming to my yard. And we go through all the different things that have changed. And usually what it ends up being is one of the neighbors started spraying pesticides. They started spraying their lawn. It's killing all the insects in the neighborhood. The birds have nothing to eat, so they disappear. So keep the pesticides out. Keep your yard natural. And speaking of neighbors, get them to create a habitat. Then we're not just creating backyard habitats, we're creating corridors. Yeah, wildlife corridors. It's nice when the wildlife can go from one spot to the next, to the next, to the next. Yeah, they have an entire area, not just one little yard in an entire huge neighborhood. Instead, they have the whole neighborhood. So convince your neighbors to do the same thing. Create healthy backyard habitats. Maybe when they start seeing all the wildlife you're getting, they'll want to do it themselves. Now, I want to briefly talk about getting some credit for this. Yeah, if you really enjoy doing it and you want to get a little bit of credit, the National Wildlife Federation actually has what they call the Backyard Habitat Program, where they will teach you how to create a habitat just like I did in this episode. And they have resources online to help you build it right. Now, the National Wildlife Federation Backyard Habitat Program started in 1973, and it basically encourages gardening for wildlife. Now, there are a lot of resources online to find out more information. I'll try to leave some of the links in the show notes. There's National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife. There's Earth Easy, Solutions for Sustainable Living. They have a backyard wildlife habitat page where they show you all about how to make a plan, how to develop the habitat. And of course, Audubon has bird-friendly communities. So there's a lot of resources out there. The Audubon Society, garden clubs, the library, the internet, ornithological societies, which are birding groups. now that you have your habitat, you know how to keep it healthy, you know how to keep it going. Now you can actually use it, not just for your enjoyment, not for the animals' enjoyment, but also for scientific research. Real briefly, because I have an entire episode on this, I did want to talk about citizen science. Citizen science is basically backyard conservation to help scientists gather information. You can do things like the Birdhouse Network. You can do Project Feeder Watch, Project Pigeon Watch if you live in the city. I use eBird a lot, where I record what birds are in my backyard and join my habitat. You can join a Christmas bird count. Another thing I do, if you have a wetland in your property, you can do this too. Frog Watch, the Great Backyard Bird Count, Firefly Watch. There are so many wildlife citizen science programs that you can do in your own backyard. Now, the last thing I want to talk about. What about the wildlife that you attracted to your backyard that you don't want? You have this great habitat. You invited all the wildlife. Well, all the wildlife includes some animals that you may not want. Maybe a bear decides to come into your property. Maybe that coyote that you don't like. I don't mind either of these coming on my property unless they get too close to the house. But maybe you don't want these animals in your backyard. Or maybe you're one of those squirrel haters. Yeah, someone who does not like the squirrels who keep coming to your feeders and stealing all the food from the birds. Well, they want to eat too. So there's a couple of things that you can do to get rid of the problem wildlife. Maybe you have a Cooper's hawk or a red-tailed hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk coming and taking out the birds at your bird feeders. Hey, you provided a feeding ground for these hawks as well. They're not eating the seed, but they're eating the birds that are eating the seed. So how do you get rid of them? Stop feeding the birds. I know you're all yelling at me right now. I get this question all the time. How do I get rid of that nasty hawk that's killing all my birds? And I always give the same answer. Stop feeding the birds. I'm not talking permanently, so don't yell at me. I don't need the emails. I don't need the bad remarks sent to me. I'm talking about a short period of time. Stop feeding the birds. Empty your bird feeders for a couple of days. The birds will disappear, which means there's no food for the hawks. They'll disappear. They'll go off and find someplace else to find food. Then you can fill your feeders again, and the birds will come back. So that's the easiest way to get rid of a nuisance hawk. Now, what about squirrels? Well, if you are feeding the birds, you're probably going to get squirrels and chipmunks. You can buy baffles. You can buy all sorts of things to deter the squirrels and the chipmunks. Very few of them truly work 100%. Squirrels are pretty smart creatures. They'll figure out these baffles and these other ways that you are trying to keep them away. So my thought is, or my suggestion, I should say, is enjoy them too. Learn to live with them. They're part of nature. And what if you have like grackles? I'm not a big fan of grackles. They will clean out my feeders. Change your feed. I had a problem with the grackles clean out my feeder the one year. I got so frustrated because I was going through a lot of seed. And I like the grackles, don't get me wrong. But I don't like them cleaning out my feeders because then the other birds don't get as much to eat. So I switched to safflower for a while. And the safflower seed was more expensive at first, but then the grackles disappeared and I went back to the black oil. And the grackles never came back because they're like, oh, this guy doesn't have anything I like. So they disappeared and I was able to go back to the black oil, which is less expensive than the safflower seed. Or you could just start feeding thistle. You'll still get some birds, but the grackles, they don't really like the thistle. So just check to see what bird feed those birds that you don't want around like to eat. Now, if you have bears coming around, you just want to take down your feeders for a while. Let the bear move on, let them get out of your area, and then you can go back to feeding again. So that's the best way to deal with what we consider nuisance wildlife. But remember, all these wild animals deserve to be in your yard, but I get it. So I hope you're going to create a backyard habitat for your enjoyment, for the wildlife enjoyment, and for citizen science as well. And I hope I gave you enough information to do that. If you need more, I'll try to leave some links in the show notes for you to look up more information on creating the backyard habitat. It's a lot of fun to do, and I encourage you to do it. I'll also have links in the show notes for supporting the podcast. Go to my Ko-Fi page, links in the show notes again. And don't forget to invite a friend next time when you listen to the podcast. Introduce the podcast to as many people as you can. And above all, keep exploring the nature around you. Have a great day. Did you know that plastic is made with oil, a fossil fuel that pollutes the environment? And did you know that only about 15% of all plastic is recycled into new products? Wouldn't it be awesome if we could live our lives without plastic so that we could stop harming the planet? Well, there's a company that wants to help you do just that. Life Without Plastic sells products that will reduce or eliminate your dependence on plastic. They have a large selection from toothbrushes to food storage containers to drinking straws, all plastic free. And it's reasonably priced. So what are you waiting for? Check out all these great plastic-free products and help save the planet. Just click on the link in the show notes to find out more and to start your journey to being plastic-free.